Oh, it's a big nondescript box of China's finest. Need more hands. Oh. Now get along, you two. But wait, there's more. It's like Christmas morning all over again. Look at all the things. Get out of here. Yeah. Shiny new fuel tank. With this box and a few straggler orders for little things that I didn't know I needed, I pretty much have everything in-house right now to complete this project. Before I start ripping this car apart to install this stuff, I want to talk about something. I've gotten a bunch of comments from people that just don't quite understand what I'm doing. So I want to go through that real fast. I've had a list of dream projects for a long, long time. That's not one of them. Ignore that. Pretend you don't see that. A Cummins-powered ramp truck, that was one of them. I've had all the parts together to do it like 3 times and it's never happened. Now I have one. Nice. Barracuda drag car with a 4-speed and a small block. Another one I've wanted to build for a very long time. Well, now it's happening. And a Turbo Slant 6 is another one of those dream builds. I've been thinking about this for years. Initially, I was thinking belt-driven supercharger, but I came around to the turbo side of thinkings after I bought a Subaru WRX, which is kind of a silly story. Incidentally, I recently acquired another turbo Subaru. This one is a Legacy GT. It's also slower, and it's an automatic. That's not the point. If you don't know about turbo Subarus, they're kind of ridiculous. The all-wheel drive thing, that's kind of an important component of it, but even so, we're talking about a small engine with a turbocharger and an intercooler and EFI. And it does awesome things. I can't show you those awesome things right now because for some reason the battery's dead. It's fine, it's just brand new. So if that little 2.5 liter Subaru engine can do awesome things, well, we're probably at an advantage with our 2.8 liter inline 6, right? Okay, the Subaru cylinder head is vastly superior to the Slant 6, but that's another story. Anyway, the point was that Subaru inspired me. I really wanted to apply that same exact formula to a little Slant 6 engine and see what would happen. And I've been collecting parts, like this EFI kit, for years to do this. So now the time is finally here. Yes, of course, boosting a V8 will make more horsepower. That is not the point. The point is the challenge. The point is to do something interesting, something unique, and to fulfill a dream. And don't worry, we're going to boost a V8 too. But until then, pay no attention to the blower behind the curtain. I've had questions about whether I'm going to upgrade the Slant 6. Yes, I am, but not yet. My plan, as it has always been, is to do this in stages. Stage 1 is just the EFI swap. What's it drive like with that done? How many horse ponies does it make? Is it better than the crappy carburetor I took off? And why is the answer yes? Another comment I keep hearing, why would you use fuel injection? Put a carburetor back on it. Listen, I'm like the carburetor, simple, cheap, effective guy. I've done this in so many videos. I've said it so many times. These EFI kits kinda suck. And for your normal daily driver, a simple carburetor is so much better. I talked Dylan, who owns the Start Sport, out of putting EFI in this thing for exactly that reason. Every other classic in my fleet has a carburetor, and it'll stay that way. But I'm putting a turbo on a Slant 6. The EFI will be so much easier to tune, so much easier to live with. Yes, I could have built a blow-through carburetor for this thing, but it's such a weird combination. The EFI makes all of this much, much easier to deal with. So that's why I'm doing this. There's another aspect too. This is different. It's not the same thing I do all the time. I kind of like that. It's kind of exciting. I'm getting out of my comfort zone. I once heard a wise man say, everything worth doing in life exists outside of your comfort zone. I kind of believe that. And in this case, for this job, that's where I'm going. With the EFI system sorted, the fuel supply system sorted, the tune roughly workable, the cooling system fixed, the timing chain replaced, all the tune-up parts done, and the engine in a good state naturally aspirated, then we'll throw boost at it. And then we'll probably throw more boost at it. And then we'll upgrade the engine. We'll upgrade the valve springs. We'll port a spare cylinder head and slap that on there. We'll port match the intake and the exhaust manifold. We'll probably put a cam in this thing eventually. Down the line, a forged piston is probably a good idea. I'm not planning to run deep into the double digits on boost, so hopefully we're okay with this for now. I'm going to pretend we are either way. By the way, the compression ratio of the 1963 170 is 8.2 to 1. With all that said, let's start doing turbo stuff. By which I mean, of course, let's replace the fuel tank. If you watched the first two videos on the Valiant, you know I installed this inline fuel pump. I said at that time its days were numbered and it probably wasn't going to work very well. And I was right, although it's not entirely the pump's fault. It turns out this original fuel tank is full of rust, which should come as a surprise to no one. In the video where I installed the EFI setup, and indeed in every EFI swap video I have ever done, I have advised that what you need for one of these setups is an EFI tank with a pump in it, just like this one. I had done some Google searching looking for an early A-body tank, and I couldn't find one. Multiple commenters on the last video informed me that I was totally wrong, and I even was sent links. So here it is. The early A tank is special because the filler neck hole is tiny. I think this dimple here matches the later A filler neck, but I could be wrong. Anyway, they didn't include a grommet, so that's unfortunate. I'll have to use my old one, and it's probably bad. These things take a universal 5-screw sending unit for the gauge. I did get one to match the factory gauge, so we might actually have a fuel gauge on this thing. And then for the fuel pump, they use this 6-screw setup. And Tanks Inc., who sells these beautiful things, provides multiple pump options. In my previous EFI swap endeavors, I've only ever gone for their lowest horsepower pump. I think it's good for something like 400, and I'm not planning to make more than 400 here, but the fact that I'm running boost made me think more fuel pump is probably better than less. So I've gone for the bigger, fancier pump. This is the GPA4, and I think it's good to 500 horsepower. Obviously, it comes with setup instructions, which I'm about to follow. The long and the short of it is, you measure the depth of the tank, and then you cut the line so the pump and strainer end up roughly at the bottom of it, and the return line should be about 1 inch off of it. As you can see, there's no metal bracket that supports the pump in this thing. The only thing that adds additional reinforcement other than this nylon fuel line is a pair of zip ties that go around this return line next to it. It has occurred to me that I didn't mention why you don't want to run one of these pumps. For one thing, they suck at pulling fuel. They're supposed to be below the fuel tank and very close to it. As you can see, this one's several feet away and it's not below the tank. The other issue is tank baffling. The factory tank, of course, does not have that. And so with that external pump, or with a pump added to the stock tank, anytime you corner hard, accelerate hard, or brake hard with anything less than like a full tank of gas, it's possible to uncover the sock or pickup and starve that pump for fuel. There is a danger of that thing pulling air in and nothing good is going to happen after that. So you really want a baffled tank, just like this one. Have I mentioned that I really like this car? I do. It's so cool and it looks so much better with the center lines. Also, I learned recently that only Signet's got that fancy center emblem. I've got my pump mocked up together, so I dropped it into the tank to make sure it doesn't hit the bottom, which it doesn't. I think it's good. Hopefully it's good. Also, you can clock this thing however you want, but I'm going to clock it this way. For now, I'm going to connect the fuel lines I already made to this thing. That way I can get it up and running quickly. Long term, I'm going to swap to AN lines. 1, for safety. 2, so it's race legal. You know, because race car. And here's the almost completed pump setup. Note, I was able to get the nylon line over the pump just by breathing on it. They actually recommend putting that thing in hot water, but that worked fine for me. Might be harder if it was colder out. It's zip tied together, the strainer is installed, and that actually points forward in the tank. If I had aimed it rearward, I think it would have hit the edge of the sump. So this is good. Now I just have to get the wires situated, and that's actually kind of trick. They provide these pass-through fixtures. These are essentially a compression fitting, but for wiring. The ferrule in this case is that little rubber ring with a washer on top. And then you've got these nut deals that go down on top and tighten that down to create a perfect seal. There you go. Fully set up, ready to drop in the tank. I do still have to set up the sending unit and tighten down those fuel fittings and screw these things in and attach a vent line, which is this whole other thing. But unfortunately, I'm out of time and I gotta go get a pizza. What? What do you want? It's days later, and the pump is finished and in. Well, it's not screwed down, but anyway. Now I need to set up the sending unit in a similar manner by setting the height, the depth of the tank, whatever, and then throw a chunk of vent line on there. Then I'll start dropping the old tank, which is definitely half full of mostly terrible gas and rust. Because the sending unit sits outside of the fuel pan or baffle down there, the depth of the tank is slightly different, and the setup instructions for this are different too. According to the diagram here, the center point of the rheostat there, the piece that the arm pivots on, needs to be right at half of the depth of the tank, which in our case is, well, it's 8 3/8 divided by 2, but also you have to add an eighth. It's 4 1/4 inches, let's just say. Because this sending unit is universal, it comes with a mounting extension bracket. And because this tank is tiny, I removed that and shortened the sending unit to this. Now, according to the instructions, I need to cut this chunk off the bottom, so the lowest part is the bottom of the rheostat there, which I did with the tiny cordless cutoff tool. In the process, pointing sparks at myself and almost setting my flannel on fire. Now, I get to install the float and figure out the length for that. The instructions say to install the float so the top of the float is flush with the bottom of the gasket when it's at the full mark. So that's what I've done, give or take, roughly. Note that when it's low, it doesn't quite actually reach the bottom of the tank. It measures about 8 inches. That means you've got a bit of a reserve once the gauge hits empty. Also note, the range of the float arm can be adjusted by bending those tabs. As you can see, they were pre-bent at the factory, so I'm gonna leave them just how they are. I could resistance check this thing and make sure it's right, but I don't feel like it. Make sure you've got that screw good and tight, otherwise, the float could fall off and that would be bad. And then cut the excess off that arm, leaving enough that it can hit its tab there. Done. Oh, also note, I installed this with that hook facing this way, so hopefully the ball can't just magically float out of it. I don't know that that could ever happen anyway, but it seemed like a good idea. Now, unlike the pump, the sending unit and its gasket are actually clocked, so you can only install them one way. That way is with the text facing this way. There are no other obvious marks. It's a while later, and I've got this tank fully set up and ready to install. Admire the vent setup. They give you that kind of angled T there, so that's hooked to the vent on the pump and the vent on the tank. I did label everything, which will hopefully make things easier later. I'll definitely be removing this tank and reinstalling it at least once. Then I made up this harness. It's got pump positive. It's got a ground, which I'm using to ground both the sending unit and the pump assembly on this common stud. And then here's the extended power wire. I'm considering running this pump off its own relay. Currently, it's powered by the power module for the Atomic EFI. It should have plenty of juice to run this, but it might be a problem in the future. Ah, yes, and then of course we've got our sending unit wire here, signal wire. It is blue. That's actually the factory color code for that wire, so that should make things simple and easy to understand, I hope. Covered myself in gas, of course, but now I've got this set up to hopefully mostly kind of sort of drain the fuel tank before I have to drop it down. I will need this gas to start the car, so there's that. It is running through both filters, so I think it's coming out kind of sort of clean. It's not coming out quickly because, of course, I already ruined this pump. When I had this thing running last, the fuel pressure sensor was showing 4. That filter might be clogged too. I'm gonna check that in a minute. One little flaw in this setup, I'm only just realizing. I can't take that filter out with the clamp in place. I mean, that's not great, obviously, but there was still fuel coming through it. This could be a pickup problem. This ain't it, Chief. Guess I'm gonna have to drop the tank not empty and then sink a line in it or something to pump the fuel out. Yeah, it stopped moving fuel altogether. This is most likely a pickup problem. That thing might be like rusted to pieces or something equally horrible. Remember though, this car ran perfectly fine. Well, it ran with a mechanical pump and carb. Yeah, pickup in there is clogged solid. And I know that because when I pulled the fuel feed line, there was vacuum in there. There should not be vacuum in there. So once again, despite all the mean things I said about this pump setup, this is all totally my fault for just trusting this fuel tank. Don't ask me why I even bothered trying this, but I just learned the front left wheel doesn't really turn. That's kind of a problem. Well, here it is, the moment I've all been waiting for. I've got a transmission jack under the old tank. I'm gonna loosen the one strap, which is done over here. I even sprayed the J-bolt. Then we'll get this thing dropped down and hopefully I can slide it off the filler neck. Spoiler alert, that's gonna suck. I guess that works. I find this hard to believe, but with the strap loose and the jack lowered slightly, I just kind of wiggled the tank off the filler neck and it's free now. It'll be a miracle if the new one goes back on it like that. Well, that's cool. Gross. Also, there's a lot of gas in this thing. Good news, everyone. This original tank uses a filler neck O-ring. The new one uses the lock-over grommet. Now I get to try and figure that out. There's that temporary return fitting I used. It never really got tight. It didn't leak too badly, but it leaked a little. All right, I'm irritated. The original tank out of the 63 Dart convertible, which of course I changed the tank in, also has an O-ring set up here. This tank doesn't. The fact that they say this fits a 63, but they don't include an essential piece to make it work, that's an issue. I really don't know why they wouldn't just give you a new grommet with this, but they didn't. So now I have a car on a lift with no fuel tank that can't run, a tank I can't really put in without a grommet, and a headache. Recall, this is supposed to be the end-all be-all final fuel tank setup for this thing. I'm trying to make it nice, you know, and racetrack safe and all. But I kind of need to install this, and since I don't have the rubber grommet, I'm going to attempt to make one. Now I've measured everything. The opening here is 2 inches, and my spare filler neck, which I dug out of the parts pile, is 1 5/8 inches. That means I need to fill a 3/8 gap around this thing. If I divide that by 2, given that, you know, it's split between the 2 sides of the circle there, that's 3/16 on each side. I should think a 1/4 inch of rubber would give enough material for some squish, and that might create a nice seal. My genius idea was to cut a hose open and slot it over that opening, cut it to the right length, glue it at the top, and call it a day. But every hose I can find is only about 1/8 of an inch. That means I'm gonna have to double up the hose. This 1/2 inch heater hose fits over that 5/16 fuel hose, so I guess this is what I'm gonna use. I'm gonna slice them both open, cut them to the right length, put them together, probably glue the crap out of it, make sure the spare filler neck fits outside of the car, and then reinstall the new tank. All right, similar idea, different execution. I ended up using 1 layer of 1/4 inch hose, slit open, which I carefully remade, 4 times. This one seemed to be the closest until a test fitting when I realized it still didn't fit that well. So I said screw it, and I super glued in another section of hose. This is a decent seal. It's not 100% though. It's decent. I can't fit a second layer. There just isn't enough room. So I'm gonna do the thing you're not supposed to do. Slather some silicone on here when I install the filler neck. I think it'll be fine, ish. I'm not gonna put a full tank in this anytime soon, maybe ever, let's say. I think this will help prevent major amounts of gasoline from sloshing out. It's not gonna be 100%, but this is what I can manage right now. It's really weird attaching shiny new parts to a car like this. It's perverse. It's kind of fun. It's also the kind of thing you might see on one of those reality TV car shows, which I have no interest in being. But in this case, I need this thing. As you've seen, the other tank was not going to work. Of course, in that same vein, it's only going to get worse from here. I've got lines running through what used to house the pre-filter. Luckily, I had this chunk of high-pressure line left over that was like 8 inches longer than what I needed to replace all that. So there you go. I kept the EFI filter in the same spot with the same clamp, which I have to remove to get it out of the car, which is unfortunate. I'm going to join these 2 wires, ground this one, and then start dumping fuel in the tank, and this thing should run again. Note, I did not finish installing the rollover valve. That's like an important safety thingy. It's supposed to be above the filler neck, but outside of the car, which means the trunk is not an option. It's probably going to live up inside the wheel well. That's a future Jamie problem. Every single time I try to put gas in this thing, it makes a horrible mess. Anyway, the fuel coming out of the tank didn't look as bad as I expected, all things considered. So I've got like 4.5 gallons of it in the new tank. Hopefully that's enough to run it for a bit, set the fuel pressure, etc. I need to switch over to premium fuel, like quickly, because boost, but this is enough to run it on for now. First time priming the new pump, and we'll see if the gauge moves. It's so much quieter than the old one. The gauge did move. It's right under empty, so there's not a whole lot of gas in there. Now that there's fuel in it, I can hardly hear it. Anyway, I guess we'll see if it runs. It does. It's stalled, which is ridiculous, but it was showing 38 PSI of fuel pressure, so that's about right. I don't know what it is in the tune of this thing, but every single time it cold starts, when it idles down the first time, it stalls. the AFR there. Oh, why is it going to... Okay. Yeah, so pretty sure the oxygen sensor is already fouled. Nice. Oh yeah, you can hear the old mechanical pump just plugging away happily down here. I'm gonna have to delete that and the factory coil to make a spot for the intercooler pipe to fit through here. Yeah, I don't know what's with this wideband. It just starts wigging out and then the thing dies. Okay, I kind of do know what's with it. There's a huge exhaust leak and it's probably got oil on it now, which is not good. Okay, so I think we've learned that these injectors are indeed too large for this engine. At idle, it can't pull enough fuel out to like be happy. It's close. It's right on the bleeding edge. My question, of course, is once it's under boost, what's that going to be like? I was curious what effect, if any, tweaking the distributor timing might have on this. And I found something that I've found on many Slant 6s before. With that advanced as far as it could go, it seems like it still wants more. Although I will say with the EFI, the response wasn't as drastic as with the carburetor. I'm strongly suspecting a stretched timing chain is an issue here, and I have a new one for it anyway. I really want to dive in on installing new stuff and getting this thing tuned and ready for boost. But I also kind of want to do a before test. There is a small issue with that today, unlike every other day leading up to today, and that's my lack of working wipers in this car. Remind me to get a wiper motor. It sure sounds happier now. I like that. It idled itself up and did not idle down, so that's interesting. Oh yeah, I forgot the seized brake. Oh, it's a gutless turd, I can tell you that. I did lean out the power valve setting a lot, and yet it still smells super rich. Yeah, gutless turd. Nice. The problem with the Holley 1920 I took off of this, same as every Holley 1920 ever, it wouldn't idle, like at all. So the fact that this still sometimes struggles with that, hilarious. I'm still feeling this in the rear end, kind of. Way less than with the old lumpy tires, but it's interesting. I do realize, of course, the naturally aspirated 170 Slant 6 is never going to be a psycho powerhouse. But I do feel like it should make more power than it does. Next thing I'm going to do, dive in, rip this radiator out, change the timing chain and gears, change the plugs, change all the tune-up parts, as I intended to do like a week ago. And then we'll probably swap to the electronic style distributor, which I had planned all along. That way, we can trigger the atomic with that, and then trigger the 6A with the atomic. By doing that, we get computerized timing control, which is going to be very important for boost, and we get a red line, and that would be nice. So now that I got it kind of hot, step A is to drain the radiator. I've only just remembered this coolant was brand new because this block was fully drained. Ah, no, it was brand used. It's just a Slant 6.
Bugs and bees and...
Also known as leak sealer?
Sure. Egg whites work, right?
So I've heard. There you go. Let it all out. Things are really going to start escalating quickly now, because that radiator is not going back in. The fancy one is. Then I need to install and wire fan relays to control those fans. I also need to get a temperature sensor that reads correctly, now that I'm thinking about that. I also need to get a separate transmission cooler and mount that. This is going to be a long day. Tell you what, while that drains, I'm going to go get a sandwich. I ate some pizza. Now I'm back. What's going on in here? It kind of looks like an old school thermostat, like half broken, and there's no coolant sitting on top of it, which tells me it doesn't thermostat correctly. So I actually didn't realize at first that this is totally the wrong radiator, but it is. It's held on with one bolt that I think is in a factory hole on that side. And on this side, it's got a nut and a bolt through a random drilled hole, and that's it. The new radiator isn't going to mount right either, but at least I can improve that situation. I was just kidding when I said one of these bolt locations was factory. It's not at all. It's spaced out with random nuts and fancy hardware there. Recently, I made a video about swapping Slant 6s for V8s, which frankly would have been a lot easier than whatever nightmare I've got going on here. Anyway, in that video, I alleged that all of these radiator openings in these A-bodies were 22 inches. No, that one's 20. I don't want to totally hack up or ruin this car, but I'm not above making some mild alterations, which is good because, well, for one thing, intercooler. I was really hoping I could hide that thing all the way down to the bottom, but you could see how little space there is back behind that valence, or valance, or whatever the heck you want to call it. Anyway, it's going to have to go higher up. And there's actually more than one reason for that too. I could trim these boots about an inch on the inside of each one and bring that dimension in. As it is currently, it's 35 inches. So we could get it down to 33 with some hackery. The space available between these frame rails, at least the top flat sections, 27 inches. Which our radiator does fit in, by the way, like just. And the brackets don't, so those are getting modified too. The space I have available on top of these frame rails without modifying the inner fenders, 32 and a half or so. Maybe I can fudge those boots that much. Maybe. Or maybe I get to bash these inner fenders with a hammer. Or maybe the intercooler comes even higher up, which it might have to fit behind this grill, actually. This is going to be challenging. I'll just tell you that right now. And I'll also tell you that hood latch support is gone. Flipping it this way, it doesn't look as bad as I expected. There's actually already a hole on that side that I could run that intercooler boot through, but then the pipe would go through the battery, and that would be a problem. Just so we're all on the same page, I am not leaving this thing yellow. It'll be black. All right, if I trim up those boots and cut some holes here, I think I can pass this pipe under the battery and leave it in place. Although I may relocate it to the trunk eventually anyway. And it almost fits in that indent temple thingy, which I'm about to cut out anyway. Didn't I say I was gonna do the timing chain? There's just so much to think about. Were the fan and pulley bolts supposed to be tight? Just wondering. On today's episode of That Escalated Quickly, I deleted the heater hoses because, of course, now that they're drained, there is no reason to not replace those. Oh, that's interesting. I've never seen a thermostat that looks like that. I'm gonna put it on the shelf and replace it. Also, there's some leak stopper hair stuff in here. Shocking, I know. Recall I came up with this crazy concoction of fittings for the ECT, engine coolant temperature sensor, for the EFI system. My thought was, why can't I just drill and tap an extra hole in this cylinder head to check coolant temperature? And turns out I can. There's a perfect spot for it right here. So I'll be doing that carefully. Yeah, it's cast iron. It's really easy to drill and tap. And I happen to have the correct pipe tap, so that's no problem. Then that sensor should actually work, which is kind of important. A commenter on the last video mentioned those water necks or thermostat housings that have a sensor hole threaded in them. The problem with that is it's above the thermostat, so it has no reading until the thermostat opens and coolant is actually cycling through there. This needs to read at all times, so that's not going to work. I'm pretty sure the only bolts that have actually been tight on this thing so far were the water pump bolts. If you hadn't noticed, that bottom one was relieving itself of some coolant. It's almost done now. Water pump is off. I made some more mess and found some really interesting smells. Now I'm finally down to the timing cover. I've got to knock some chunks of grime off so I can even access those bolts. I'm going to slightly clean it. I'm going to get the puller, get this balancer thingy off, and then unbolt the cover and knock it off of there. The chunks coming off of this thing, pretty intense. Pulling the balancer / pulley looks like this, because there's no room for a power tool, but the short puller thing was too short. Anyway, this is super fun. Did you know the Slant 6 doesn't have a balancer bolt? At least these early basic ones don't. Later ones with added power steering pulleys, I think, do. Or maybe AC. There should be threads in that crank. I can add a bolt, and I probably will, but factory there isn't one. Would you stay put? God. I stand corrected. There are no threads in this crank for a balancer bolt, so I won't be adding one. I'll just be beating that thing back on with a hammer and a wood block and calling it a day. Anyway, here's the timing chain. As you can see, thankfully, this does appear to predate nylon gears, so that's fine. But it is a little floppy. It's not the worst. I've definitely seen worse, but it's not great. O'Reilly only had a standard type single row chain set, so that's what I got. No dual roller. Somewhere in the world, somewhere makes one, I'm sure. Correction to the correction. There are threads in here. They were just packed full of grime like everything else. I was trying to figure out why these gears look different. That's because they're completely wrong. I was about to get pretty upset. Thankfully, realized it was my own boo-boo. I got timing sets for this and Mitchell's black W100 that turned out to be slightly dead at the same time, so yeah, now these parts look right. There's a specialty tool for pulling timing gears off of cranks. They're roughly a press fit, and so they should be kind of hard to take off. I never have that tool at hand for some reason. I think I ruined the only one I ever bought. Anyway, I just used a pry bar, side to side, and it popped right off. I'll drive the new one on there with a brass drift and a hammer, and I will apply a little bit of grease. I could not see a timing mark at all on the old cam gear, and it was a different design, so I couldn't see the pinhole either. So I took a guess, and of course it was wrong, so I've had to reinstall the cam gear so I can turn the cam. It's been quite a while since I did this on a Slant 6, and I forgot how dumb it is. Basically, the timing marks make no sense. They kind of sort of point at each other, but the only way to be sure you've got it right is to jam some kind of straight edge in there, in this case the alternator bracket, and line up the two dots, the center of the cam gear and the center of the crank, which I think I've done, hopefully. I'm strongly considering pulling the valve cover again to double check this though. I don't want to get it wrong. Thanks to the T-handles on the valve cover, that takes like a minute and a half. Hey, here's a good one. Pulled the number 1 plug so I could wash the piston in there, which is actually pretty easy in the Slant with the valve cover off, because you can just kind of see it. Anyway, that is the wrong spark plug. It's got short threads. It's supposed to have long threads. So, assuming they're all the same plugs, which I bet they are, they're nice and new. That's cool and all. But these tips are shrouded like this far away from the chamber. That can't be great for power or anything else. I was strongly considering testing this thing with just the timing done and the mechanical fan removed, and then moving on to tune-up stuff, but I guess I'm gonna do the tune-up stuff now, since that is all clearly very wrong. Okay, this is interesting. I was musing about how obnoxious it is that when you straight edge those dots, nothing lines up, like this keyway, for example. You'd think it might point straight upward, or it might point, 90 degrees off from the cap line there. That would make sense. That would be a TDC position, right? Well, with the dot lined up, that's not where it is. Look how low down that dot is now. It doesn't look like it's going to be straight in line with the cam gear at all. The plot thickens. The dot is closer to the keyway on the original gear. It's not by like a whole tooth or anything. It's like half a tooth, because this tooth, which lines up with the keyway on this one, doesn't on the new one. The teeth appear to be a different design, and okay, that's fine, but why is the dot so different? Ultimately, it doesn't matter because I can just compare the valve opening events and see how the cam is timed. This is a Mickey Thompson trick? I don't know, I learned it from Tony. Anyway, we're on TDC 1 now. Both rockers are slack, and if we take our straight edge and set it across these valves, we've got a gap like that from the exhaust down to the intake. I can actually measure that. I'm going to go find some feeler gauges and get back to this in a second. I've measured the difference is just about 47 thou. Not that I can show you that with one hand. 47 thou kind of seems like a lot, but anyway, now we're going to spin the crank 1 full rotation, thus turning the cam 180 degrees, and we'll see if the gap is the same. I've been messing around with this for a little bit because the timing marks are slightly different than on the original set, and I really suspected something was goofy. I was also not 100% precise in finding TDC, so I messed around with this thing for quite some time, only to realize it totally is right. Now what's kind of odd here, as you can probably tell, is at TDC, the dots on the gears do not line up. I think they did that because of the different cut of the teeth, so they wouldn't have aligned perfectly with a gap. They set it up instead, so if you straight edged it like I showed you, that would work. If you try to eyeball where TDC is, you realize the marks are not quite there. Anyway, I've checked with the valves and with the top of the piston, and this does indeed seem to be correct. If you need to do timing on a Slant 6 and you encounter this, and everything seems weird to you, that's probably why. I did want to point this out to you. It's condensation. Isn't that interesting? Of course, this thing sat around for years and years, and apparently I haven't run it enough to get all this crap out of here. Also, look at that front seal. That is disgusting. Since I have these parts off, I think I'm obligated to clean and paint them. I'd really like to just put this thing back together, change the plugs, and see how it runs, but There's so much more to do, so I might as well do it nicely. Obviously, I don't believe in perfect, but I did clean this thoroughly and sand it and put a new seal in it, so good enough. Why is this paint coming out chunky? I did shake it. And okay, that actually looks pretty good, except for the spots that don't and the runs. I'm pretty much out of time for tonight, but I'm gonna at least get some shiny red paint on this new water pump. That'll be nice too. Nice. Well, kind of looks nice. Could just be the lighting. Today is tomorrow, and tomorrow, or today, I'm realizing that the new chain is not that much less floppy than the old one. I still feel good about doing this. Anyway, deflector dish is in. Make sure you don't forget that. I'm gonna get this front of the engine stuff back together, sealed up, and then I'm gonna start drilling and cutting and doing all that sort of stuff. I have much more important things to work on than this today, so I need to get it to an acceptable stopping point. After today, I can't touch it for like a week, so yeah. In case you were wondering, yes, I did respray the stuff I painted last night, because it looked like butt. I am still going to paint the balancer and the fan pulley. And at some point, I might spritz some red paint on the chunks of block that you can see. Not that that'll last for long or look very good at all. I swear I tested this vacuum module, but it doesn't, which is fine. I'm getting rid of the points distributor anyway. I really don't think there's much to be learned from these goofy short plugs, which is good because the middle ones are in some random order. I didn't actually set them out right. This is definitely number 1, which doesn't look too far off. It has been rich in the past, but it looks like it's turning the right color. Number 6 is like black and maybe oily? Certainly rich. Again, these plugs are goofy and don't fit right, so I'm not going to count this as a real plug read. We'll get to that later. Well, I zigzagged around the project, as I often do, to the distributor. This is an electronic Chrysler Slant 6 distributor in pieces, and you'll notice I've welded it. That is to eliminate the advance mechanism in there. This is super easy to do with like an MSD distributor. You just pop a stud in a hole and bolt it solid, but I don't have that. I have a factory electronic Chrysler unit. So I've disassembled it, performed that operation, ground it down so it doesn't rub on the plate, and now I'm going to reassemble this thing. I do think I've mentioned this, but I'm doing a bit of a switch here. When I first got this thing running, I was just using the regular points distributor with its advance curve, and I thought a working vacuum module, but not so much. Anyway, I used that to trigger the MSD box, and I used the MSD box to trigger the atomic EFI unit. Now I'm going to be switching things around. I've got this wiring here, which you'll see is connected to what appears to be a standard MSD distributor connector. That one comes out of the atomics harness. I'm going to use the electronic distributor, which I'll install here, to trigger the atomic box, and then the atomic box is going to trigger the MSD box to fire that coil. Flipping things around like this gives me timing control in the computer, which is great. It also gives me a boost retard function very easily without any extra modules or messing around. Now I could use the vacuum pod for this, kind of, and I did consider that. I'm going to leave it in place on the distributor, although I've locked out the mechanical advance mechanism. So that is an option later, but I think timing control in the atomic is going to make the most sense. So essentially, unless I do use the vacuum module there, this thing just becomes a dumb trigger. It tells the atomic when each plug is supposed to be fired, and that thing will do some magic math and figure out when the plug actually is fired. I've welded the weights in the full advanced position. I'm hoping that I can set the distributor to about 22 degrees and we'll be good there. Rotor phasing could be an issue here. So once I get it up and running, I will be checking the phasing of the rotor with an extra distributor cap. I'll drill a hole in that, and that way, with a mark on the rotor, we'll be able to see where that plug is firing and verify that it's straight in line with the cap contact. If it's not, we can tweak the cap's position from there. Oh yeah, in case it wasn't obvious, I also cleaned the crap out of this thing, which is why I've now been working on it for an hour! Yikes! More yikes. Timing cover is in! So shiny. Oh, I did clean and paint the timing tab, and I will make a nice giant paint pen mark on 0 degrees. Don't leave these off. I've experienced at least 2 Slant 6s over the years that didn't have the timing tab anymore. That's a bit of a pain. I got fancy and painted the distributor vacuum advance module too. You know, a tiny part that no one will ever see. I didn't have the same shade of gold that was on it before, but I did have this fantastic copper. Quit yelling at me! Why did it stall? Anyway, I can only assume this is what a turbo slant will be like. A slug, and then, it does stuff. Whee! I did clean up the ceiling area on the harmonic balancer, which I've painted up all nice-ish. You can still see a slight groove there, but I'm going with it. Balancer and timing tab are in. And again, because I've got the valve cover and the spark plug tube out, I can see the top of the piston, so I didn't use the piston stop, but I did rock it back and forth several times, eyeball the middle of the dwell area, and it seems to be very, very close to dead on the timing mark. So I marked that with a pen, and we're gonna leave it like that. Of course, with computer control, I'm hardly gonna need that mark, but at least syncing the distributor, I probably will. Here we go, finished distributor. Oh, I need to clean more metal shavings. Don't worry about that. It's all together. It's nice. It's locked out, welded. Also, I put some shim material, which means electrical tape, under this drive gear because it rocked back and forth. It wasn't a tight fit on the shaft, and I did not like that. Check the air gap, seems good. Ensured a tight fitment for the rotor there as well. That's something I've seen many times where the rotor rocks around. I just kind of generally went through this thing and made sure everything was good, greased the important little points, and now we're ready to go. Also, it's a little thing, but as I'm going through every system on this car, I'm making little notes that'll make it easier to take apart and put back together later. Like, obviously marking number 1 here. Obviously marking number 1 here. Marking where the reluctor pin goes, so I can get that back in easily next time. That sort of thing. I mentioned the magnetic pickup distributor connection that goes to the atomic here. I've got an extension attached there, and I'm about to terminate those wires. They loop all the way around here, nicely down to the distributor. Hopefully, there's enough slack here that this doesn't end up in the way of the intercooler pipe, which is gonna have to go right through here. Also, I removed the coil, but I still have to remove the fuel pump and get a block-off plate. I'll do that later. Then there will be a whole lot more room for activities. I wanted to show you this. This white wire was the points trigger, which was coming off of the MSD box to trigger the MSD atomic. Now what I'm doing is using this yellow wire out of the atomic to trigger the points in wire on the 6A. So essentially all I did here was flip the inputs and the outputs so it'll be triggered the opposite direction. Let's talk spark plugs for boost and for slant 6s in general, at least if they've got spark plug tubes. I actually discussed this same idea in a video on a Hemi quite some time ago. Essentially, any engine that uses a tube like this should not have a spark plug washer. The tube acts as the washer. It acts as the gasket between the head and the body of the plug. If you've got both, they're going to tend to chew each other up. I've seen this many times. Those two pieces, the aluminum tube here, and this washer, whatever the heck it's made out of, it's designed to crush some, they kind of crush together and bad stuff happens. So, if you've got a dual tube engine, a Hemi or a Slant 6 for our purposes, you cut that washer off. What I do is bend it up slightly with a flathead screwdriver, and then I get in there with a pair of snips and snip it. When we're talking spark plugs for boost, there are a couple things that need to be taken into account. First, heat range. This plug is 2 ranges colder than the factory plug. That's supposed to help prevent pre-ignition under boost. And the gap. This gap is 32 thou. That's most likely the factory gap for the Slant 6. That's common for many engines of this type and this era. I'm going to close that to 28 thou. Now for high amounts of boost, you may even want to go down to around 20 thou or even smaller. We're not going there. So I'm going to go for 28. I think that'll be just fine. If you've watched the channel for a long time, you may know that I usually don't bother with gapping spark plugs at all. I just kind of look at them and make sure they're not crushed because in my experience, they're almost always already gapped at 32 thou when you buy plugs for these applications. But in this case, I'm going to individually gap each plug to 28 thou. This may need to be changed in the future. This heat range may not be right. I'm going to have to verify that with later experimentation and plug reading. As for the washer thing, you may be wondering why the catalog only provides a spark plug that has a washer. Well, washer-free plugs used to be common, but these days those applications are few and far between, and they're all 60 years old. So all the plugs you buy today look like this. That seems to be a bit of lost knowledge in the industry. All right, here's a classic hallmark of a blunder like this one where short plugs were where long plugs were supposed to be. The plug gets tight early. As you can see, the tube has not set down yet. That's because the threads closest to the chamber are very nasty. There, that's close. It wasn't close. That's where it ended up. This is where they first thread, so. Yeah, took quite a bit of effort to get there. It's not ideal. Should have run a chaser down the threads to knock the chunks out, but, well, I didn't. All the spark plugs went in, no problem, except number 6, which you may recall was all like rich and stuff. So I've got the spark plug thread chaser tool in there with a bit of grease on it to try and capture any metal shavings. And I'm gonna run it down to the bottom and then back out, and then we should be good to go. With this done, I can install some random new spark plug wires I found in my collection. They're not high performance parts or anything, but they are new, so that's good. I can pop the valve cover back on, button up a few more things, and then I think I'm ready to just hear this thing run. And then that's probably gonna be the end of this ordeal for now, because I'm not gonna be able to touch this thing until next week. Turns out we've got like a Superbird to build or something. Oh, come on. Anyway, no metal, just carbon and gunk. Okay, these wires are ridiculously long. I only need these 3 to be longer so I can like loop them back and around, and this is not that. This is a mess. But they're on there, so I'm just gonna leave them for now. Again, I'll be custom making some fancy ones at some point, I'm sure. Oh, it's 8 o'clock. The Valiant has a water pump again, not that it's gonna do anything. It's got a valve cover, breather, PCV valve hose. I need to cap that because again, I'm not using the vacuum advance now. So we'll do that, hook the battery up, key on, reprogram the atomic to fire the ignition the other way, and then we'll see if it runs. Huh, actually there isn't a trigger setting in there. Maybe this wire is just always enabled? Not sure. Hopefully with it plugged in, it just magically works. But I did turn on timing control. I set some quick parameters that, I don't know, should be close. Let's see how I did. Not good, I guess. No RPM signal. Okay, despite being very careful, apparently I wired the pickup backwards. That figures. Getting the phasing of the factory distributor to work correctly with an MSD box or an HEI or anything like that, often challenging. Every time I think I've got it worked out and I know exactly which color connects to which color, and every time I'm wrong. Anyway, now there's a signal, but I don't think there's enough timing. That starter really does sound goofy. I think I need to take the shim out of there. It's not shimmable this way, but there is a shield that way. Anyway. Okay. It always stalls. Always. Every time. I don't know why. It just likes to. Whoa. Hey, how much exhaust should be in there? So is it head gasket time already? Or does it warm up that fast? Hey, it might need some tuning. And it still does that. But this thing sounds awesome now. Yeah, pay attention to that. That might be important later. About that. I wonder if it'll run long enough to time it. Come on! Don't want to run it very long without coolant, obviously. Let's just do that. Wow. I actually smoothed it out quite a bit. Yeah, it likes more advance. Not that much though. All right, well, anyway, obviously we need to do some tuning here, but you can start to see the potential. This is going to be so nice when boost happens. Yeah. Okay, the good news is it runs better than ever. It sounds amazing. I bet it would do a burnout now. There is zero question it's making a bunch more power than it did, and I wish I could test drive it right now, but I can't. I need to get the cooling system stuff situated. I don't know about you, but I am very excited right now. This is going to be awesome. The bad news is this is the end of this video, and we still don't have a turbo anywhere near installed, which is unfortunate. I want to make a quick point about that because at least a few people felt clickbaited by my first video when I announced this as a turbo swap project, but it didn't actually get a turbo. Here we are in episode 3, and there is still no turbo. Over on the Stay Tuned channel, Tony Angelo slapped a turbo on a Slant 6 super fast and made it cool, but, you know, not necessarily the awesomest it could be. I'm trying to build something a little different, something that works, something that's, well, unique is the wrong word. This has been done, but I think my setup is going to be solid. And to that end, I'm laying a lot of groundwork here for what's to come. And I've got many, many hours into it. It's going to take weeks. I'm just one guy, and there are a lot of jobs involved here. As you can see, this thing still needs quite a bit of fine tuning. Haven't moved the temp sensor either. There's a lot. What I'm saying is, this is a build series. You're watching me build it. Step by step, I'm getting closer and closer. I know, there's no instant gratification in this. It's not making chooch noises yet. What a disappointment. How do you think I feel? I've been dreaming of this turbo slant project for like a decade now, and it's still not together. But it's so close. So I hope you'll stick with me. I think, hopefully, in the next video, we'll be bolting that on. But I can't really promise to that, can I? A quick thank you to everyone that signed up for a membership. I very much appreciate you. They've only been open for like 2 days now, and already the response has been incredible. So thank you very much. Look forward to more fun stuff coming in the future, thanks to your contributions. Until next time, as ever, thank you very much for watching. And remember, remind me to look into this. Maybe it's fine. Maybe it needs a head gasket. Oh, I'm very late for dinner.